All right, everyone, welcome back. Welcome back. It's so wonderful that we have you all here. And I want to say a few housekeeping things before we get going with our next speakers. So first, just like with our first set of speakers, there'll be time at the end of the session for questions and answers. And here's again how it will work. Type your question in the Q&A feature in the webinar, and you'll see a button for that near the bottom of your screen. When you type the question, I will see it. The rest of the attendees will not see it. And I will ask as many of them as I can of our speakers during the Q&A portion. I will apologize to some of you who asked questions of our last group of speakers. We had a lot of great questions and did not get to ask all of them, but I really appreciate all the questions and all your engagement in the speaking. You can type your questions during the presentation or after, but they'll get asked by me during that Q&A part of the presentation. Second, just a reminder, we're sending continuing education credit certificates by email in a few weeks, so look for those in your inbox. And lastly, you'll get an email after our speaker series asking for feedback, and we hope that you'll fill it out so you can learn so that we can learn from our experiences doing this and doing it this way. It's really my pleasure to introduce our next two speakers who are going to be talking about harmful immigration practices. So Dr. Stacie Papineau is Program Manager, Clinical Supervisor at Asian Americans for Community Involvement here in San Jose. Dr. Papineau is a clinical psychologist with emphasis and practice in forensic and neuropsychology. Her training and practice focuses on creating pathways for post-traumatic historical growth through the intergenerational trauma treatment model, striving to dismantle structures that dehumanize others. Currently, she provides specialty mental health treatment to foster youth, ages 0 to 21, as program manager and clinical supervisor with AACI's KDA program. She is a current fellow in the UC Davis Napa Infant Parent Mental Health Intensive Interdisciplinary Training Program, I'm sorry for mangling that, as well as a fellow with Harvard Medical School's Global Mental Health Trauma Recovery Certificate Program. Dr. Papineau is also a veteran and formerly served in the United States Air Force. Dr. Amana Ayoub is a senior staff clinician at the Center for Survivors of Torture in San Jose and has served there for more than 20 years. Dr. Ayoub has been working with survivors of torture and genocide for over 24 years, having been mentored at the Marjorie Kovler Center for the Treatment of Survivors of Torture in Chicago, Illinois. She received her doctorate in psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Having both maternal and paternal grandparents who were refugees and war survivors, she is passionate about human rights. Dr. Ayoub has worked with clients from over 65 countries around the world, with particular focus on Asian issues, survivors of the Bosnian genocide, unaccompanied minors, and the elderly. She is also an expert in child survivors of violence. It is really my great pleasure to have both Dr. Ayoub and Dr. Papineau here today to talk with us, and I'll just turn it over to the two of you to begin your presentation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This one, right? Does that work? Yeah. All right. Thank you. Appreciate you guys having us this morning, and I know that you've already been doing some training this morning, so we're happy that we have some time to talk. So I'm going to do those slides today for myself and Dr. Ayoub. So first, I just want to thank the Child Abuse Prevention Council, of Santa Clara County, for inviting us to speak and being part of the virtual speaker series. When we look at, child trauma and, the immigration process, some of the things that we need to think about is the constant onslaught of traumatic events that need to be addressed. For our time together today and moving forward, I hope that you'll all join me in the Drop the I Word campaign. So when we're working with refugee and asylum seekers, I invite you all to remember that no human being is illegal. and prefer to refer to them as undocumented, and hopefully support the change in how our country and even the world views not only their experience, but the people that are affected by that. So when we think about trauma and what affects the families and the children that we see, take a moment to consider atrocities that are likely normalized for them, where they come from and how they've grown up. Things that, typically we can never fully understand. These are just some of the things listed, the realities of their world, and the reason that we see so many people fleeing to the United States and other countries requesting support. So how do we understand the enormity of the problem? So a problem so big, you go numb even thinking about it. I mean, for many of us, that's how we respond to it, right? For some of us, particularly this past year in our country, it might be mass violence, COVID-19, the health disparities, or structural racism that we see going on, biodiversity, climate change. For the refugees, not only are these things affecting them, but the onslaught of danger and trauma they experience during their journey to cross the border can be unfathomable. This experience sets the expectations about their world and their relationships. So I'm wondering how many people, normally if we're in person, I like to be interactive and ask questions and have people participate. I know that we can't really do that today, but I'm wondering how many people have seen some of the CBP videos on the news, particularly the last few months, of children, small children, being dangled over the border walls and dropped. I saw a video 2 weeks ago, maybe, a child, I think it was 2, so as young as 2 years old, I've seen, where the child was just dangled and dropped over the wall by themselves, nobody accompanying them. Or you've all probably seen, or most of you seen, the young boy found wandering in the desert all by himself, inconsolable, crying, just stating over and over that his people left him. So I would guess that most of us, or at least some of us today on this call, might be slightly activated after hearing about these events that I just talked about, or recalling the videos if you've been able to see them on the news or YouTube as well. So I'm going to ask you to just sit with that for a minute. Sit with that activation. So one moment in our day where we're likely to have the skills to dissociate and protect ourselves, others aren't as likely or as able to do that. Families and children that make this journey, they don't have the option to dissociate or to move on to something else. This is the reality. So as you do this work, I ask you to remember that as you work with them and ask them directly to tell their story, just keep that in mind, okay? One of the things that I just find perplexing in our society right now is that we're able to send people to Mars, but we're still seeing children abandoned and wandering around alone in the desert with no family and no country. It's really unsettling. And I know that's why you're all here today. So when we consider the detention centers that are popping up around the border cities to house all the children that are coming across the border, I ask you to consider, how do we help them see reality clearly without asking them to give up on their dreams? So we know as a country, we're failing these children. And I'm not speaking about politics per se, but really just about basic human decency and behaviors. So we've all seen the photos, or likely seen photos of children in cages, sterile environments with cement, with little environmental justice. When I speak about environmental justice, what I'm, talking about, and hopefully you're familiar with, is, one of the things that people of color in our country experience every day, which includes pollution, lead poisoning, water pollution, no outdoor space, no animals. Plants and animals aren't racist, but I want you to picture a detention center and where these children are being housed. And just think about that environmental justice. Here's one of the photos. And some of you may have seen some of these photos already. In this room, there's a little bit of color. I mean, the blue chairs and stuff, but still a pretty sterile environment, right?
Dr. Papineau, I'll just add too that this picture is what the government released to assure people that that it's like summer camp. In fact, those were their exact words. It's just like summer camp. Look at this. This is exciting. Kids want to be here. This is not, in my experience, a typical room as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Appreciate that. Here's another one. Probably a little bit more realistic, right? Okay, so I ask you all to consider the rights of individuals, the children, and the idea of their rights. You know, one thing I think it's important to keep in mind as you ponder the issues going around with immigration right now in our country is, you know, rights can't be violated if they're never granted. And, you know, the way that we're viewing immigration right now, I think that's pretty poignant for all of us to remember what's happening in our country. So I'll talk a little bit about trauma and the harmful immigration practices. Trauma, not a surprise, right? Trauma, we know, alters the life of children. We've all heard and seen the current practices, but again, I ask you to think about working with these children and families and consider the constant fear that they live with. Some of these examples listed here that is just a part of their reality, right? Fearing that their family is going to be deported if maybe your family is here undocumented, never knowing when somebody's going to knock on the door and take them away. People being sent, children being sent here by themselves with nobody to tend or care for them, saying that they'll meet family members or somebody else on the other side. And then of course, children being separated from their parents or their loved ones at the borders, sometimes for months on end and never being reunited, or no information to understand how that reunification might happen. So what we're seeing with the current immigration crisis is empathic failure. And what I mean by that is the inability for people to listen to other people's stories. One of the things I think is super important for us as providers, and whether we're attorneys, we're mental health providers, we're advocates, whatever our role is to be able to sit and listen and be present for people and whatever their story holds. And that's something that I think is really difficult for a lot of us, trying to relate and understand what that means for them. What we know is human development theory tells us that children are resilient, right? How many of us have heard that? Oh, kids are resilient, they'll bounce back. However, resilience isn't an inherent action. I say that in an effort to help you understand, for us to not further blame victims, the children, for not being resilient. There shouldn't be any judgment about post-traumatic growth or their process. So let's take a moment to consider some of the long-term effects on and negative impacts on a child's health and development as a result of many of the adverse experiences they've experienced, as you can see listed here. So I'm not sure if any of you remember a raid that took place in Porterville, Iowa in 2008. I actually lived in Iowa at the time, and that's why this one really stands out for me. But to date, it's still the single largest workplace raid in the history of our country. There were 398 employees, 98% of them, which were Latino, that were arrested and detained in one day. Homeland Security swooped in, one time, there was no warning, and arrested them all. The town, Porterville, Iowa, is, as most towns in Iowa are small, but the town is only 2,200 people, the population. So if you can imagine 400 people being arrested and detained and taken away at one time, the impact, and imagine the significant impact that had on that community. The school was empty for weeks and months after that. Children left without parents, without any contact with knowing what even happened to their parents, what would happen to them, were afraid to leave their homes. In one study that was done after this, which I found particularly interesting, found that infants born to Latino mothers in the state of Iowa after that particular raid had a 24% greater chance of low birth rate the following year as compared to those that were born the previous year. There were no disparities seen in white non-Latino mothers before or after the raid. So, what we learned is that raid shows us that natural, if you will, natural experiment to see the effects of targeted immigration enforcement on birth outcomes, but also the economic stressors with, almost a fourth of that community disappearing at one time, communal and identity-based psychosocial stressors as well. All right, so when we think about other things that put children at risk of economic instability, again, looking at the deportation rates, the undocumented family members. Another study looking at the drop in the parents' income, or as related to their immigration status and ability to be able to live, even if they are sent to live with somebody else and a family member or a neighbor, somebody takes them, and there's still significant impacts on that. Okay, so what happens if the children or the parents are arrested or deported? These situations aren't like criminal cases in our country where everyone is afforded an attorney. I don't know if everybody knows that or not, but immigration court cases are considered civil matters, and therefore, if someone can't afford an attorney to help them with their immigration status, or if they're arrested or detained, then they're left to defend themselves, which can lead to prolonged detention, often deportation, and little understanding or even consideration for the parental relationships or safeguards that their children may need or may have. Oftentimes, children are placed in the foster care system, or as we're seeing now, especially the last few months, that they're also detained somewhere else. Again, just a little bit further clarification on that. All right, so when we look at toxic stress, let's talk about how toxic stress and trauma affects people. So regulation, as we know, is the first thing that we need to look at with trauma in kids. Kids with a sympathetic nervous system, like what's this giving off? Some kids can shut down, some kids can become aggressive, run off. And so one of the things that I like to look at is Stephen Porges's work. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's pretty great. I encourage you all to take a look at his work on the neurobiology of safety and how that affects each of us. Neurobiology is influenced by our own life experiences. So if you think about that and how that can be impacted with these experiences and really detrimental effects. So foster parents, caregivers, detention centers, adults and children may not open up due to trying to buffer themselves or protect themselves, since maybe they don't know how long people will stay, or an inability to understand what they've experienced. I see this a lot in the foster youth that we work with, caregivers, shielding themselves and protecting themselves. And if you think about the people that are working in these detention centers also trying to protect themselves, it really can impact that process for them. So there's a fight or flight response that people talk about all the time, and that's designed for people to respond to emergency. But what we know through research and experience and history is that your body is not designed to be in that state 24/7. So when that happens, your cortisol levels, your stress hormones are activated all the time. That can cause some severe damage, indefinite damage as well. So how can we work with caregivers and providers to help regulate? What does the caregiver bring, per se? If you want to regulate a child, you have to look at first, is there a regulated adult in their environment? Again, whether that's in foster care in the home or in these detention centers or homes that these kids get placed in. When we look at the child's experiences through the lens of, say, attachment theory, it isn't about who is the biological parent, it's about the connection. So in attachment theory, security equals resilience. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind as we're placing these kids and seeing them in detention centers and maybe putting them in homes. If we're going to learn lessons and move forward in a way of realizing that what mental health is and well-being for all, we're going to have to persevere in calling for policy and action changes, and that compassion, equity, and has equal rights at heart. And I know that's why you're all here today. Okay. So the trauma of separation in children. So when I look at trauma, I look at it from the lens of, if anything can be trauma, well, then nothing is probably trauma, right? Without understanding, I caution you to keep creating a new narrative through repetition. And that way we can help kids see that they're safe now. We know that they bring their history with them, and a lot of that will likely never understand or know all the things that they've been through. But that history helps shape how they view their world. So for example, do they have enough exposure to a real relationship to have attachment? When you think about that 2-year-old being tossed over the wall, dangled over the wall, what their attachment is going to look like, and their resilience, and how they're going to view the world without those relationships. Are their childhood experiences consistent with breaking of bonds? I mean, that's a risk factor, right? We know that secure children don't cry, they talk. That's a big difference. Children hold nonverbal trauma in their body, and they're continually assessing, is this world safe or dangerous? Who will be there to protect me? How do I communicate with these people? Or why did they do those things to me? So I love this analogy as a reminder for how we approach this work and understand lifelong impacts that these children may experience. I encourage you all to remember that humanity and dignity is in people's stories, right? And in order to make change, we need to center the voices of the marginalized voices and survivors, all the children that are affected, and we need to listen. One of the things that we know is that every human being needs support until the day they die, right? In some way or another. So in looking at the physiological and neurobiological damage, so a child is trying to make sense out of it. So as we assess the child, we have to think about these things. So if a child grew up in safety, the brain is organized around exploration. But if you grow up with stress, the brain is organized around threat detection and danger continually, right? So exploration is a key component for development and the capacity for mental health. Safety is important. What is safety, you might ask? For these kids, as we're thinking about so I'm going to think about it just maybe in their context. So not only their physical and psychological safety, but is it safe to take risk, personal risk, or with other people? They might be wondering, am I not afraid of being labeled or criticized for thoughts and feelings? When our fears are understood and validated by others, that's psychological safety. So when children feel safe, seen, are able to be soothed, most of the time they will develop security. So do I feel I am seen in your mind's eye? Am I perceived deeply and empathetically? Am I safe? Can you soothe me? Those are questions that they're asking themselves. And then what they need from us is to help to determine this internal sense of well-being for them. They need help with that to be able to feel safe. Again, Stephen Porges' work, if you haven't read him, I recommend it. Some of his books are easier to read than others, but it'll give you the whole concept about neurobiology of safety, which I really love. So you're probably wondering, why is she going on this tangent, right? So for me, first, in order to develop, I need a sense of safety, right? So if I don't feel safe, I'm going to respond a certain way and exhibit certain behaviors. Our nervous system is here to protect us. Neuroception is constantly looking out for danger. Am I in danger? If I'm in danger, do I have to activate my sympathetic nervous system? My autonomic nervous system will have to go off. This is important because if we can understand this as caregivers and providers, what it does is talks about the neurobiology and not the child is doing something willfully to make you miserable. If the nervous system is going off all the time and in a constant state of arousal, as we just talked about, it really can change their processes, right? So we need to really tune into the nonverbal aspects of this as well. What we know is children pay attention to our faces, our body posture, our vocalizations. It's inviting. And even as adults, we do that as well. It's not just children, right? We pay attention to nonverbal cues about safety or not safety. All of that is in response to the vagal nerve, right? So not listening to words as much as faces, as much as if I'm looking at you, and that's going to help me detect threat. If it detects safety or spontaneously engages with others, this is an okay place. That might be what they're saying to themselves, that we're going to be able to play and be curious. So what happens with this vagal nerve? Sympathetic nervous system goes, we're okay here, folks. It's okay. We don't need to run off. We're feeling safe. So you can engage, you can do co-regulation, which is very important for all of us, right? But you can engage with this person and play. And that might be what their nervous system is telling them. And that'll help them stay calm and connected. And that's optimal health. That's what we want for everybody, right? But what happens if the sympathetic nervous system goes off? We're in danger and we need to mobilize. Well, this is what brings many of our kids into treatment, right? That fight or flight. They're hyper aroused, they're very quickly going off the sympathetic nervous system. But how can they escape if it's a life-threatening danger? That might be what they're feeling. So they might become totally immobilized. The parasympathetic, I'm in trouble talking this morning. The parasympathetic nervous system says, calm down, be prepared, so that you can live for another day and move forward, right? So I need to make sure to survive. That might be what it's saying. So when I feel safe, I can engage and play with you. And then they can have those interactions, right? But if they feel in danger, the sympathetic nervous system is going to go off, and it's either going to say flee, or if it can cry, especially if somebody is young, right? Crying might be their natural response. But if it doesn't work, what am I going to do? I'm going to dissociate, probably, right? So when we understand somebody's history, we can understand somebody's neurobiology. When we see a symptom of freezing, that blank spell, sometimes maybe stomach aches, that's all a form of dissociation, right? Now, dissociation tends to get a bad rap, I think. And I don't think there's anything wrong with dissociation in levels, right? So I can promise you that almost all of you have, over the last half hour with us so far, have dissociated in some way. You might have gone into your head and said, oh, I need to do this tomorrow, or I'm looking forward to my plans next week. Or you might have said, hey, that's really interesting. I want to learn more about that. Or maybe even, something that I talked about or shared, particularly the stories, may have activated you a little bit, or what we're talking about might have activated you. So for you, you know that you can breathe a little bit and calm yourself down, right? That's not a problem because you can quickly come back out of that. But it's the deep dissociation that causes problems, right? So if I'm an infant and I'm crying and nobody comes to me, or even a young child, like say in a detention center, and I'm stressed out, I'm hungry, probably cold, maybe thirsty, the only way I can deal with it is to slow down my body's response and dissociate it. So for children that we work with, it's important to remember that. And it's not a bad thing. That's how they've had to survive. And they've had to develop those survival skills for themselves. We all want safety, right? Everybody does. Here's an example. So I'm walking down the street. Actually, this happened a few weeks ago. So I'm walking down the street with my husband, and I can be absent-minded sometimes, and I start to cross the street, and I didn't actually look to make sure that cars had stopped before crossing. And there was a car that was just coming through the end of the light, right as it was turning red. So my husband grabs my arm and pulls me back, which is good. This actually happens all the time to us. But I felt a sense of threat, right? What do I do? So I had my co-regulator with me, my spouse. So I grabbed his arm back. I felt his embrace holding me, and that calmed me down. So I could look over and see that the car wasn't that close to me, right? And so that's like, I tell you that because I think that's a great example of my neuro section going off, my sympathetic system going, hey, what's going on here? And then saying, hey, you're all right, you're safe. Because I had, my co-regulator with me and was able to feel his embrace. Now, me, I'm a typically developing woman, right? But what happens so many times with these little kids and individuals is that the sympathetic nervous system goes off and, will run and hide as a way of staying safe, that fight or flight response, and you dissociate. And that becomes your biased perception of the world. That becomes your go-to, if you will. I'm doing air quotes, but nobody can see me. That's your survival mode. And you use that narrative to modify your own behavior and understand other people's behaviors. And what happens if you get stuck in that narrative? I've had many foster parents tell me frustrated, super frustrated, come to me and say, but they're safe now. They have a bed. They've never had a bed before. I feed them. I take them to school. Why aren't they okay? Why are they still giving me trouble? They still fight me. They're unhappy. They cry. And they have a deep dissociation, right? Well, the reason is, and of course I validate and empathetic with them and just try to explain to them the reason is they bring their history along with them, as we all do, right? But their history is how they've been able to survive and how they've got to that place. They bring that narrative along with them. So what you have to do over repetition, like a lot, is create new neural connections about what a relationship is. Teach them, how can I co-regulate? How can you feel like I'm available for you? And again, create that new narrative, right? So that's why I think it's really important to understand neurobiology and what that looks like and how that leads to one's behavior, how one's life experiences affects one's neurobiology and the brain organization, which influences your perception of the world and influences how you respond to it and how you keep responding to it. I know I went off on a bit of a tangent there. Okay, so I want you to think about this slide in context to the example I just shared and the story I just shared. Dr. Ayoub, do you have any thoughts so far on anything?
I was just thinking about when you said like sort of having someone to intervene or sort of like ground you. And in these detention centers, in many, if not all of them, staff is not allowed to touch children at all. Now, I understand that that rule is supposed to be to protect against sexual abuse, and I've actually participated in some federal lawsuits against detention centers where there has been, physical abuse, sexual abuse. So I understand why in general they would think that was a good idea, but to deny being able to hold someone's hand or touch someone's shoulder or give a child a hug, especially when all the family separations were happening. There was a person, Antoine Davidson, who actually came forward and he resigned from his center. And he said, we weren't allowed to hug these children at all. We had to just stand back and just let them experience this all by themselves. And so he resigned, and he actually called, it's kind of hero because he called attention to this, because he said, if we're not allowed to do this, I could see the way that things were going to go, and it was only going to get worse. So with all these things going on, and then not being able to touch a child, to hug them or to comfort them is not something that they can understand.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. Great example. All right. So as you can see here, it's not in color. I like seeing them in color just because it really shows all the different aspects of it, but you still can get the idea, right? So this is an example of the noted changes in brain development from a child with prolonged stress experienced primarily through neglect, right? Significant neglect. So physiological changes in the brain have been observed, looking at lifelong impact on cognitive and social development. If you're not familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry's work, I recommend you take a look. He's done extensive work on brain mapping and the development as a result of childhood trauma and abuse. Other one. Okay, so what we know is that PTSD and other stress reaction disorders cause significant physical and emotional damage, right? Not a surprise, we know that. And oftentimes individuals, especially kids, can't even explain the depths of their own impairment when this happens. We know in children that a dysregulated brain kills curiosity. It alters, their ability to play and view the world with an open lens. So what can you do? You can praise them for sharing and for surviving. So in all of your interactions with these children, build strengths and self-healing. And remember, I encourage you all to remember that responses may take a long time for them to tell their story and deal with the humiliation. And I encourage you to think about humiliation as like an arrow to the heart of attachment, right? So as a provider, advocate, lawyer, caregiver, you don't need to go after their story like it's a buried treasure, right? We have to have these details. We need to know what happened to you. Instead, I encourage you to build an empathetic relationship of trust. And over time, be ready to listen. Use organic conversation. And I know that some of you on here are lawyers and work with a system that is trying to do evaluations maybe, or do the legal work to help protect rights and keep people here. And sometimes you need that information quickly. So listening over time doesn't really work for you, but I just encourage you to keep in mind, about that process and what it's like for them, right? You might get someone to tell you their whole story in a year from now or 2 years from now. It might be so much more because they just weren't ready, right? And maybe they're not even able to process what happened to them. So,
Dr. Papineau, I just want to give you a time check. We're about halfway through, so thanks so much. This has been fantastic. I just wanted to give you that time check.
Yep, thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm just getting ready to turn it over to Dr. Ayoub. But I encourage you all doing this work to ask yourselves before I go, did I show up in a way that allows people to succeed in all your interactions with these families and children? Okay, Dr. Ayoub?
Thank you. Dr. Papineau, I actually see an option at the top of the screen to request remote control from you, but I'm not going to mess with it because I'm not a technical person at all. So Dr. Papineau is going to actually be very nice enough to, when I say next, please go to the next slide. So, okay. So again, as thank you, Dr. Papineau, everything that you said is so important. So again, we know that this scientific research exists. So this is not like sort of bleeding heart liberalism or political at all, right? We know that this is actually scientific, that this does damage, right? So I like this quote because it's when the separation of families was happening, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the APA, pretty much every medical organization and psychological organization that you could think of was basically saying that to pretend that this is not happening is to ignore all of this scientific evidence. So next, please. So again, the feelings of abandonment that kids have. And again, we're not just talking about kids in detention centers. We're talking about kids with undocumented parents, undocumented families. These kids may be undocumented themselves, or they may be US citizens, but either they may not understand how the system works. And besides, even if you're a child and you're safe here, you have your papers, you were born in the United States. If your family isn't safe as well, then it really doesn't mean anything. You don't want your family, you don't want to go to school and have your family be taken away, right? So feelings of abandonment can happen when you feel abandoned, when your parents are taken away, or you can feel that feeling even not knowing if your parents are going to be taken away. So there was a case example of an 8-year-old girl who was removed from her home, and she was separated from her undocumented parents just for several days as her parents awaited charges, got a lawyer. So 2 years later, from that few days, she had such severe separation anxiety, she couldn't let go of them ever. She couldn't even be in a separate room, right? She had nightmares. She would get triggered by police vehicles, sirens, the sight of any sort of uniform that represented a police officer or even a security guard, right? So going to Safeway and seeing the grocery store and seeing a security guard would trigger her. She lived in extreme fear that her parents would do something wrong and be taken away again, and it stayed inside of her. So a lot of children don't know what to do with that anger and fear. So some of them, especially when developmentally you enter the teenage years, the children strike out at the parents because they don't understand why their parents put them in this position, or if their parents are taken away, why their parents abandoned them. And they sometimes blame them. So there's difficulty reattaching. It's not just like, oh, well, you let my parents come back, so now everything's fine. It's like, no, that damage is done, even if it's a few days. And in most cases, it's much longer than that, or it's unresolved. So next, please. So again, this causes attachment disorder, separation anxiety. It has such devastating effects because attachment is one of the most profound things that we have, one of the profound connections that we have to each other. So if you're a parent, you know that, from the moment of birth, that skin on skin contact is so important, whether you're a mother or father, right? To have that newborn held against you, right? But even if you adopt a child, even if you just have a spouse, there's no children involved, that attachment is the primary thing that comforts us, right? And our bodies secrete hormones that are the good comforting hormones and the good chemicals on contact that reinforces that bond. Next, please. So a child's sense of safety really depends on that relationship. So without that relationship and that attachment, and I must say secure attachment, right? The parts of the brain that deal with attachment and fear, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, develop differently. So, I'm very careful with, children and adults with PTSD, not to say they don't have brain damage. We don't want them to conceptualize themselves as brain damage, but their brain develops differently. And among us, we can say it's not in a good way, right? So the reason that such children go on to develop PTSD either then or later in life is that those neurons start firing irregularly. So the parts of the brain that, like Dr. Papineau said, that sorts things into safe or dangerous doesn't work. And a metaphor that I use a lot with my clients is it's like they have a broken alarm, like a broken fire alarm or smoke alarm. So we all need that alarm. Can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't have that alarm, right? We'd be walking in a dark alley at 2 a.m., like sort of oblivious to the danger. We'd walk in front of traffic, like Dr. Papineau was talking about. So we need that alarm to go off when there's danger. But the problem is with a child in this situation, with a child who has gone through that trauma, their alarm was constantly going off. So even if they're reconnected or reattached to their parents, that alarm is now broken. So it goes off when there's no danger, and sometimes it doesn't go off when there is danger. So that's what therapy is for, right? Is sort of for healing that alarm, because we don't want to get rid of that alarm. We want to fix the alarm so that it only goes off when there's danger. And when it's not going off, we want that person to be able to relax. So that's what's happening when the neurons start firing irregularly. Is, people feel this sense of they're not safe, it's unpredictable, sometimes it leads to panic attacks. So it's that fight or flight response that's broken. So, their friends will say to them, like, what's wrong? We're just sitting in the classroom, no one's after you, but they feel like someone is. Or they can dissociate and go into the third thing that people don't talk about with fight or flight, the freeze. They can just freeze, right? Sometimes you see kids too that have severe attachment problems, not just in that they're scared and anxious about wanting to attach to their parents, but you have kids that their system is so broken that they can't attach anymore to their family or to anyone. So, they don't care. It's sort of the experiments where the parent comes back into the room and the insecurely attached child doesn't even care. They don't notice, right? So situations that would normally provoke responses, physiological responses in other people, like, increased heart rate, sweaty palms, these kids have nothing. And that's actually a worse scenario than having panic symptoms. So, next, please. So the good news is that children's brains have high elasticity, right? Much more so than adult brains, right? So if you do the right intervention as the trauma is happening, it allows you to transform a traumatic experience into an empowering one. Obviously, the best thing is to prevent the trauma from happening, But if the trauma happens, if there's going to be family separations, if you can do interventions right away and get the children help, if you reunite the family as quickly as possible, then you can limit the amount of trauma and actually turn it into a positive experience or an experience of resilience. But if you withhold mental health treatment and support during this time, that critical window is lost. And then it's not an issue of will they have problems in the future? It's an issue of how severe those problems will be. So next, please. So changes in personality in these kids. So studies have shown, and families also report, that separated children become withdrawn, shy. They only speak when spoken to, even when they're reunified. So again, these kids don't just snap back to who they were. This is a profound change in themselves. I mean, it's a real existential crisis. So they're often clingy. They have extreme fear at any sort of separation, refuse to let their parents out of their sight. So going to school, which is a necessity and it's the law, right, is now a source of terror. The parents going to be there when they return. The children may have somatic symptoms. I can't go to school. I have a stomach ache. I have a headache. So many of them suffer from separation anxiety, the crying uncontrollably, recurring nightmares, night terrors. And if you leave these things untreated, this trauma leads to deeper problems like long-term PTSD, substance abuse, suicidal behavior. And again, when you get these children who turn into teenagers, and developmentally, that's such a turbulent time anyway, leads to things like sexual acting out, cutting behavior, self-mutilation, self-loathing, just a horrible sequence of events. So next, please. So again, eating disorders, problems with trust and unresolved anger, and again, even towards their own parents. So it's not like they can, they aren't cognitively developed enough to say, oh, I'm really mad at the government for doing this to me. They don't have that sophistication and that understanding. So they're angry at the safest person that they can be angry at, which is their parents and their family, right? And then anger is how depression can manifest itself in children and teenagers. So when you see an angry child or a teenager, very often that is a depressed child. So that it's not necessarily that they're oppositional, defiant, the conduct disorder. They are depressed, and that's how it's coming out. They don't have the, again, the sophistication to go and say to somebody, I'm very sad. It comes out as anger. So studies have shown that boys that are held in detention, even for very short periods of time, like 2 or 3 weeks, can develop what looks like antisocial behavior, violence, substance abuse problems. But again, that's not something that is happening organically with them. It's something that's being caused by this situation, and it's preventable if they weren't put in that situation. Teenage girls tend to internalize more, and they may show depressive disorders, substance abuse, again, things like eating disorders, cutting. So even the idea of separation exposes children to stress and trauma. So again, you don't need to ever have your parents be taken away. It's the idea every day of what if, your mom is late coming home from work and you're thinking, was she taken away? Your parents say, let's go to, Pier 39 and let's go see the seals and sea lions. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to go because, what if there's a raid, and we never come back, right? So children that are present during these immigration raids, it's extra awful, right? So it's awful to come home and have your parents suddenly be gone, but witnessing the parents being forcibly removed, I mean, it's heartbreaking, right? And a lot of times there's unnecessary force and brutality used. There's humiliation. So imagine seeing your parents who you should put on a pedestal and idealize and, hold such respect for. You see these loved ones humiliated and sort of treated like, criminals. And that's what I've heard children say is, they treated my dad like a criminal. Did my dad do something wrong? Is my mom a bad person? So it really starts this spiral of disconnection with your parents. And again, a lot of, especially younger children, don't understand legal status. So even if people aren't, they just think that being an immigrant may mean that you're unauthorized. So even children that have their papers or family that do have their papers may think to themselves, I could be taken away anyway. And this especially does depend on politics. You know, when you have people say, you know, or tweet out every day, you know, that they're going to get, they want to reduce immigration, that immigrants are bad, that they want to get rid of all immigrants, the line between undocumented and documented becomes really blurred, especially when you use words like illegal. Next, please. Next, please. Sorry. Thank you. And again, feelings of being punished. Again, like, you know, are we criminals? Are we doing something wrong? So a lot of these people, I would say almost everyone who comes to this country, a lot of them are refugees that have never sort of understood the system or had money to hire a lawyer or representation. So a lot of them, if they had those privileges, could have gotten asylum status, and then they would be safe and they would have their papers and they would be documented. But a lot of them, you know, don't know how the system works, or the system lets them down. And so they're fleeing from countries for a reason. You know, they're not necessarily coming here because, you know, just for economic, you know, improvement. They're coming here because they're fleeing gangs, they're fleeing narco cartels, they're fleeing violence against them because they're women or a certain religion or ethnicity, right? Like countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador have the world's highest murder rates for children and adolescents. And if you're a child and adolescent in one of those countries, you know, when you get to a certain age, you're going to face, like, you know, being recruited for those gangs or narco cartels, and saying no is not an option. So you're caught, and so families will choose to flee. So some children are reunited, but many remain in detention centers with their families. And we sort of came to see that as a victory, right? At least that you can keep the family together, but it's not a great place to be in detention. It's, again, the humiliation, the uncertainty, like your life is on pause, like someone pressed pause, right? You can't have the same dreams that children should have. So long-term detention can have devastating effects on children. And that's why we also, you know, are pushing for rules that exist on how long we can keep children in detention, because certain administrations have wanted to just have it be indefinite. And we know that each day that passes increases the damage, right? And a lot of US born children, you know, are made to feel like they're not truly American, even though they might not even speak their parents' language, or they've never been to their parents' country, but they're, you know, treated by people on the street, they're treated by their peers like you're illegal, you know. And again, I really thank Dr. Papineau for saying, let's get rid of that word altogether. So hate speech, hate crimes are on the rise. Right now, we're seeing it a lot with Asian Americans, but, you know, pick a week and it'll, you know, Hispanics, people from the Middle East, I mean, and anywhere where Africa, or anywhere where your skin color, I mean, the melanin has a lot to do with it, right? So targeting anyone of color, anyone that speaks a different language. And again, it's hard not to bring politics into this, because there's a lot of stoking of that xenophobia and a lot of that rhetoric. So next, please. Loss of safety in the world and trust in others. I mean, that's the biggest loss with PTSD. So as psychologists, we're committed to policies that keep families together. So it's not safe or ethical to send young immigrants back to dangerous countries that they fled with their parents. It's not okay to have them separated. So this is not a morally neutral stance. We can have objective opinions. We can use science. We can, you know, sort of discuss how these things are intellectually, but we can't be morally neutral on this. So next, please. Children are being arrested, talk about harmful immigration practices. So ICE in the past, I would say 5 years, has ramped up sort of where they feel their authority can go. So children are being arrested the moment they turn 18, like they're aware of their birthdays, they show up, and they don't even have, these children don't have a post-18 plan. Like they don't know what happens once they turn 18. So they're just literally ripped from childhood. So there was a case that sticks out in my example that happened here in California of a young man who was arrested at his prom. Now they could have picked him up at any other point, but they deliberately chose to arrest him at his prom, to humiliate him, to strike terror and fear in the other children or teenagers or families that were undocumented. And, you know, stories like that are all over the place, right? And then those 18-year-olds are put into adult facilities, even though developmentally they're adolescents. And we know that brain development doesn't even stop until about 24, maybe even higher, but they're treated as adults all of a sudden, right? So this is a quote from someone who says, "At the shelter, I'd been in a place where they took care of us and treated us well. But here," she's talking about the adult facility, "officials yelled at us, got mad at us for not speaking English, and almost everyone else was older than 30. The bathrooms didn't have separation, even to shower. I was embarrassed and uncomfortable." And I think there are good guards in these detention centers, but there are also even more bad ones. And I think it's not necessarily that you're a bad one, although I think that some people are drawn to that sort of position because they can have control over other people, just like, sort of with police brutality. But I think even working where you're working in a position like that, over time, you dehumanize people because it makes your job easier and it helps you sleep better at night. So I hear this from a lot of children and adults who are in these detention centers that, the guards aren't necessarily bad people, but they treat them like, sort of moving parts, just sort of shuffling them around. So next, please. Again, these kids have increased vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. They can start self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, especially, like I said, you're hitting those tween and teenage years, acting out sexually, self-mutilation. Increased suicidal ideation is a huge problem. Older children or teens may join gangs when they're released as a form of finding inclusion and protection. And I have to say, I totally understand that, right? Here is a gang of people who are usually your ethnicity or who understand what it's like to live undocumented or to have undocumented family, and they're promising you protection and a place where you feel like you belong. So even teenagers who as children really had this rather naive idea of like, I'm an American and my family's American, and now they don't feel like they are. They're not being treated like Americans. So they join gangs to feel a sense of inclusion in something, right? So immigrants have been arrested by ICE after coming forward to retrieve unaccompanied family members. So again, we're creating this system where people are terrified to even come forward and help. So you'll have this like 3-year-old, like the example of, there's many, many examples of this, but I think I know the one you were talking about, Dr. Papineau, where the 3-year-old was dangled and dropped. So if she has relatives, which she probably does, that was the thinking. Either children like that are dumped by coyotes, which is very bad because they're just like, they want to get rid of the kid. But a lot of the times it's done by desperate parents and desperate relatives that are like, if I drop my child over, they'll figure out who she is. My other relatives will come and claim them, and then they'll be safe in the United States. They'll be allowed to stay. But the problem is the relatives are terrified to come forward because they're undocumented. So that child might just sit, in a detention center, which is their parents' worst nightmare. So under a sensitive locations policy, ICE is prohibited from making arrests at school, but that happens a lot anyway. It happens right outside the school grounds. Literally like a few feet, like past the playground or where, children are waiting to go in and out to school. And also undocumented immigrants are detained while taking their kids to school, like in the carpool line. They're arrested at hospitals and places of worship. So we have to also have humane policies of how we arrest people that are undocumented and how we treat them, and not sort of subjecting them to this humiliation and then this constant anxiety that you could be anywhere, that nowhere is safe. You could be at a movie theater, and ICE could come in and, make people show their documentation, which is not legal, but will happen. They've gone on to a big thing a couple of years ago was Greyhound. They would go on to Greyhound buses and intimidate the bus drivers into making them believe that they had the authority for everyone on the bus to show their papers. And a lot of the bus drivers would go along with it because they were intimidated. And, Greyhound had to actually make a stance and say, no, we're not allowing that as a company. Courtrooms should be safe places as well. So law enforcement is having a hard time sort of getting people to cooperate, right, to testify against the real bad guys because people are afraid to come forward. So if people are attacked or raped or there's gang activity in the community, they're afraid to come forward because then the focus will be on them. So next, please. So even immigrants who are, I can't, sort of emphasize this enough, who haven't experienced this type of trauma. So maybe none of this bad stuff has happened to them, but they're constantly fearful that it will. And that's what Dr. Papineau was talking about with this toxic stress. And we aren't, again, capable of handling this toxic stress for long periods of time. For when it happens for short periods of time in childhood or in adulthood, it's okay. It actually builds resilience, little bursts of trauma, and then you learn and grow from that, but not this, indefinite. So, so many in the community are experiencing anxiety. Some are having flashbacks to violence from their home country. They're like, I came here to get away from that. What's happening here? Some are retreating into the shadows. They're afraid to drive, bring their children to school, or seek medical care. I mean, I've heard from hundreds of spouses that are terrified when their spouse goes to work. They literally watch at the window, like for them to come home, because all it takes is a traffic violation for them to get pulled over. And sometimes not even a traffic violation, right? They could get pulled over by someone who's racist, driving while black, driving while brown, and all of a sudden that person is shipped away. And so again, even American-born citizens are experiencing increased anxiety, like who's going to be next? If they target this population, then who's going to be next? Are they going to target, and under Trump, he was saying, volubly, he was saying that he also wanted to target these children, whether they were born here or not. So that sent, terror throughout the community. And it sort of didn't matter to them whether he was able to do that or not. Like if you're a lawyer or a judge, you're like, you can say what you want, you can't just do that. There are lots of things to prevent that from happening, but you don't know that, especially as a child, right? And if you're the target. And again, hate crimes, huge on the rise, especially in COVID times with Asian American communities. Next, please. That says it all. Next, please. So the grief is not imaginary about the uprooting experience and severe immigration enforcement. Again, there's science behind it. It is real. PTSD is real. It is not political. It is based in reality. Next, please. Again, children who have nightmares, high school children who drop out because they're afraid to go to school or they're just depressed. They're feeling suicidal because their parents are threatened. And a lot of kids feeling like, if they're undocumented, feeling like, why should I? Like, I've seen kids that were straight A students that really, once they realize that they're undocumented and that they don't have these papers. So I just had a case last week where I just heard a heartbreaking story of a teenager who, when he was in 8th grade, he got to go on a class trip to Washington, and he was all excited because he got this like kind of special scholarship. And he went home and said to his parents, we don't even have to pay for it. They were from El Salvador and his parents were undocumented, but he didn't know this. And he said, we don't even have to pay for it. And I was selected because I got such good grades. And all I have to show them is my passport and my social security card. And the mother's heart just sank because he didn't have those. And she had to sit him down at the age of 12 and tell him that you don't have those. You can never go on those types of trips. You will never be able to, get a driver's license, go on trips with your friends on spring breaks. You will never be able to pursue the opportunities that they're pursuing. So he had all these dreams, like, I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to see the politicians. Maybe I can get an internship in high school. And after that realization, pretty much his life just spiraled downwards, right? He just was like, why should I get these good grades? Why should I try if I have no future? Next, please. Again, living with uncertainty really does a number, and there have been on our bodies physiologically and emotionally, mentally. There have been trial programs with Latino and Asian immigrants. This is one of them that you can look at. And again, you guys will be getting copies of this whole presentation, so don't worry about having to take notes or, memorizing this, but this is a good study to look at about what it's like to be living with uncertainty and what it does to you practically and logistically, like in terms of your healthcare, and what it does to you physically, and also what it does to you emotionally as well. Next, please. again, that trauma period, you know, and some of it just never ends, like it just goes on and on and on into adulthood. That trauma is going to define how these kids see themselves, how they identify as a person, whether they even identify as an American, Mexican American, as a young person, as a student, a good person, a bad person. It will affect their whole life. Next, please. Now DACA parents and their children. Now DACA are the dreamer kids, right? Who do have a pathway to citizenship. These are kids who were born here, even if their families are undocumented. They're not kids who were born here. They're kids who were brought here when they were very young. So if they were born here, they would have automatic citizenship, but they're not. They're brought here when they're 6 months, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, they're too young to make choices on their own, but their parents bring them here, and then they're stuck in this system. Like the person that I told you about with the Washington, D.C. school trip, he was brought over when he was 6 months. So he really thought, I'm an American. He didn't remember El Salvador at all. He didn't even speak Spanish very well. But in the eyes of the law, he would be a dreamer. So he was actually able to get dreamer status and feel hopeful for the first time. And then he really started, you know, trying again in life because he got dreamer status, which meant that but now it's being, you know, it's debated going back and forth. So it depends which administration. So under the Trump administration, it just stalled. And all of a sudden, all these dreamer kids and teenagers and young adults were terrified because they had come forward and they had given all their information and applied for this program. And now they're on the government's radar. They have all their information. They know who they are. And all of a sudden it was like, nope. We're going to cut this program, forget about this program. We don't want this program. So now there's more hope. I mean, because Biden is saying that he's going to honor dreamer status and help them get citizenship. So we'll see what happens. But I know that a lot of the dreamer kids and teenagers and young adults that I know feel hope for the first time in years. So because dreamers don't have, if they don't have status, they don't have work permits, driver's licenses, they can't buy homes, they don't have health insurance, they can't get grants and student loans, they can't even accept scholarships, so they can get straight A's in high school or college when they can't accept certain fellowships or scholarships. They can't pay in-state tuition, so they can't go to the UC program, you know, and pay in-state tuition because they aren't documented. And this can affect their postgraduate studies, their jobs, everything. Next, please. Again, a dreamer's uncertainty, you know, manifests somatically as well as, you know, with self-identity conflicts. And, you know, in Spanish, sorry, it's a Freudian slip. It should be ni de aquí, not ni de acquit. Ni de aquí, ni de allá. So neither from here nor there. Next, please. This is, you can look at this later, but Latina suicide rates are really out of control. So, I mean, this is one population that is sort of a silent population. They're not speaking out much. We're not hearing much from them. Even in schools, they're not like acting out or, you know, sort of the troublemakers, but they're the ones that are really suffering, right? And for many Latinx that seek therapy, 50% don't return after their first session. So what are we doing wrong that we're not connecting with that community and we're not making, you know, sort of decreasing the stigma and making it safe for them to come to us? We also need more caregivers and professionals of color. So as of 2013, psychology workforce was almost 84% white. Next, please. Again, we're talking about a resilient population. This is a population that is strong. They rely on their work, their spirituality, social support of families. They're human beings like everybody else. They can handle this stress if they are given the tools. They're not weak, but the stress that they face is so much bigger that none of us would be able to handle it. Next, please.
Dr. Ayoub, I know you're getting close to the end.
We're almost done, yeah. So
okay, I just wanted to let you know we've got a few questions that people are excited to.
I want to be able to get to those questions. So this is just saying stability is important, those loving relationships. So next, please. We're almost at the end there. I urge you to read this later about how you can actually practically combat the negative effects of toxic stress. And these are actual suggestions, but providing stability, responsive relationships with as many caring adults. And also there's an appendix, which has lots of information on this PowerPoint that we couldn't fit into the time period. So I urge you to check that out too. So how many more do we have? I think only a couple, right, Stacie? Yeah, just more suggestions: educate, empower, encourage discussion of fears, use psychological evaluations, bring in whole families to talk about this, get teachers involved, other caregivers. Next, please. These are things of how to consider individual families and what they might be going through. Next, please. And then just a few last thoughts about kids and what they need with trauma, and some actual practical suggestions of things that you can do, like ask kids point blank, don't avoid the subject. Especially at school, there are lots of things you can do. And the appendix has lots of information for teachers as well, like actual practical things that you can do, like to actually help build a bond with these kind of children. So we'd like to open it up to questions. And
Great. Well, first of all, thank you both so much for this really thorough and detailed presentation. There's so much information in it.
Yeah.
I think that the first set of questions I've gotten really are going to some of those last thoughts that you were talking about. So the first one we have is, what are the ways that professionals working in child welfare systems or other systems can address the toxic stress you've talked about, or the trauma that you've described, for children who have been in detention centers, or even more broadly, children who are undocumented?
Well, I mean, that's why we really provided a lot of information in the appendix. We knew we couldn't get to the exact, like, this is, these are techniques you can do. In the appendix, we provide a lot of information about really specific techniques that you can use, like giving a child as many choices as you can, right? Because they don't have any choices in all of these things that we're talking about. So giving them choices about transitions, giving them options for, especially in school, these children can't handle like sort of the usual transitions and the kind of stress that most kids can handle really well, and then go home to a safe environment. So in the appendix, we provide really specific suggestions for not just in school, but if you're a therapist, if you're a care provider, how to actually interact with these children to help them feel safe, because that's at the crux of it, to help them feel safe and to help them feel valued, right? That they are wanted, that what is happening to them is not okay.
Yeah, and absolutely all your slides and all the resources in the appendix are going to be available on the Child Abuse Prevention Council website. So absolutely, we're going to do that. I think that related to that had to do with recommended therapeutic response. Both you and Dr. Papineau have talked about different psychological or developmental effects from this kind of trauma. And we had a question about what kind of therapeutic response you recommend, and over what time period, during the time period that a child is has been out of home, in an out-of-home placement, or some other time period.
Dr. Papineau, would you like to answer that?
I think that, anytime that we have access to provide those services for kids, whether it's before, after, or during their placements, is the best time. Honestly, the longer that we wait to address, the more norm and the more embedded these impairments become as part of their functioning.
One of the questions that we just got is this recording going to be available? Yes, also the recording of this presentation is going to be available on the Child Abuse Prevention Council website for people to view. One of the questions we got had to do with whether you've seen differences in the trauma experienced by children, or their ability to deal with that trauma if they have been placed with a family member versus a non-family member. And I think the questioner is asking about children who are separated from their families or from their parents.
I think we both probably have answers on this. I would say, obviously, if you can be with a family member, that's so much better, always. But I would add the caveat that there's a lot of abuse, different kinds of abuse that goes through generations. So a lot of times children are left with people that the parents think are safe, but actually there's emotional abuse or neglect or physical abuse that, you know, from people that don't know any better because they're like, well, this was done to me. And so, but even if the child is, you know, ideally in a safe environment, again, it's still going to do damage. It's not the same, you know, people aren't replaceable. So it's better to be with a grandparent or someone like that if they are healthy and treating you well. But there's always that sort of deep ache. It's never going to be the same. And you're never going to feel completely, I guess, accepted, right, in the United States.
And the other thing to consider is, you know, like Amana spoke about during her talk, was the intergenerational trauma and how that affects, you know, families and systems. You know, and those are deep wounds, and those are hard to change. So whether somebody's placed with a family member or not, we still have a lot of considerations to think about.
And again, a lot of these grandparents and aunts and uncles are people who experience trauma themselves, who either have refugee status or who should have refugee status, who have been through wars or torture, who have witnessed torture or been through, you know, like in the case of El Salvador, like witnessing civil wars or gang violence. So they're traumatized themselves. So, you know, they're barely, in a lot of cases, taking care of themselves. You know, they don't really have the emotional bandwidth to then take care of this child. They might be able to provide housing and food and, you know, hopefully, and I love you, you know, but they don't really, you know, have the resources to help this child because they're not even they're feeling broken themselves.
One of the slides you presented on talked about brain development, and one of our attendees is noting that there's been research that suggests that brain is not fully developed until 25, and whether you could talk a little bit more about the ongoing PTSD and trauma that you've talked about, and the fact of, or the research about brain development into early adulthood.
Do you want to handle this, Stacie?
I'd like to think about that for a moment.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I can say that, you know, the number keeps creeping up. So I thank you for adding this because it's true. I mean, I'm always like conservative and say 24 because that's, everybody seems to agree on that. But yeah, there are plenty of studies that say that it's even higher, and yeah, gender differences and, you know, that elastic brain, right? But, you know, it's not fully formed, and that can be sort of a good thing if you're learning languages or whatever, but it can also be such a bad thing if you're sort of trying to understand the way the world operates and you don't have all the cognitive resources yet or the emotionally developed resources. So it's a very confusing system. And again, once these kids turn 18, and maybe even before, if they look like they're older, right? Like you have the, you know, 15-year-old, you know, who has a, you know, almost a full beard, you know, and they're tall and they're big, and people will treat them like an adult, and they're just not. You know, I don't care what they look like, how big they are, how deep their voice is, you know, or with girls, how developed they are. You know, they are children.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, what we know is that the types of adversities and traumas they experience and how often the prolonged exposure to those things also makes a difference in how they develop and are able to deal with it.
And it also, you know, I think it's important to say, though, that whenever we get these kids and whenever we get these adults, I mean, like at Center for Survivors of Torture, we have elderly clients who are like in their 80s, and they grow, and, you know, you can give them psychoeducation, and they come to new understandings and can decrease their symptoms. Like, it really is never too late to learn and grow. So we're not saying that like, oh, well, these kids are done, they're damaged. You know, we're saying that we can, you know, help them and we can heal them, but it's so much more complex and so many more people are going to fall through the cracks if we don't have, you know, there's an adage about like someone who's trying to rescue children from a, you know, all these children are drowning in a river and people are running and they're trying to like, you know, grab the children and throw them on the bank and then run back and grab another children. And then someone starts running away from the river and everyone says, where are you going? Why aren't you helping? And they say, I'm running to the beginning of the river to find the son of a bitch that's throwing these people in, right? And so we need that. We need people to be at the beginning of this process to stop this, to stop these immigration practices, to stop, you know, the systemic abuses that are going on. Like someone mentioned in here, like in the education system is broken too. So teachers don't even have the bandwidth to, you know, be able to focus on the emotional development of their children. So we really need that. We need to stop doing what we're doing right now, which is just rescuing these children or trying to rescue them. We need to really prevent them from getting traumatized in the first place.
Well, I really appreciate both of you. I know all our attendees appreciate both of you making the time to present to us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
I thank everyone who signed on today for this first day of our speaker series. When you sign off, you'll also see a link to the feedback document that I talked about at the break and at the beginning. And thank you again, Dr. Papineau. Thank you again, Dr. Ayoub. We really appreciate your time today and all the information you gave us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone, and we'll see you next week.